Welcome. You are about to view a recorded talk from the online seminar series, Progress and Visions in the Scientific Study of the Mind-Matter Relation, held in 2018. The seminars aim to bring together researchers from around the globe with a background in mathematics or physics who are interested in the scientific study of consciousness and the mind-matter relation. While each seminar session consists of a talk and a discussion, the latter is not recorded, and the following video will only contain the talk. We hope you enjoy it. For further information, please visit mind-matter-relation.org.
Okay, well, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation. The title of the talk is In Search of a Physical Foundation for Biological Mentality. So the word biological mentality, by that I mean for a human, both your consciousness and your subconscious or non-conscious processes. And for animals, all the way down to whatever lower level animals you care to descend to, you can talk about their mentality, whether or not, independent of whether or not they're conscious or not. You don't have to worry about if they are or not. So biological mentality is inclusive of consciousness and non-consciousness. So let's see here. So my button doesn't work.
So just click on the blue one time, then it should work.
Click on, okay, all right, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so as everyone knows, there's many mind matter theories. I've put them into these 4 categories, and I'm not going to try to refute any of these, but I don't like any of them. So in the first category, you have that consciousness is an illusion and only the physical world is real. That's very popular with computer people these days. The second is that the physical world is an illusion and only consciousness is real. That was popular at one time. It seems to be getting more popular now. The third is everything in the physical world is conscious. And the fourth is that consciousness and the physical world interact directly. And like I say, to me, all of these theories are unsatisfactory, and I'd like to try to describe something a little different. So I have 3 goals here. The first goal is from a quote from a really great book that everyone who is interested in this field of mind-matter relationships should read. The first goal is to provide a unified explanation of how the physical and mental characteristics of organisms develop together, and do so not just by adding a clause that the mental comes along with the physical as a bonus. The second goal is that I'd like to have something that ends up experimentally falsifiable, otherwise it's all just talk, so that's very important. And the third is that I would like to have something that's compatible with all of the growing evidence for quantum effects in biology. Travis Craddock, Jack Kaczynski, Gustav Brunreuter, who's I see is on the call here. All of their work is in some way inspired by Penrose, his 1989 book and his idea of objective reduction. The good thing about Penrose is that his conjecture is falsifiable, and it may be proven to be false someday. The bad thing is that a lot of people that I've run into will look at a paper by, say, Craddock and Kaczynski, and they see that Stuart Hameroff is on the paper, and they say, well, I'm not interested in that because I don't believe in gravitational quantum reduction. But the point is, the two are completely separable. The work in quantum effects in biology goes on and is very important, and you don't have to take the Penrose objective reduction conjecture if you don't like it. You should still be aware of the work. Okay, so to outline my proposal, I've got biological mentality includes 3 very distinct layers, and I'm going to conjecture that 2 of these transcend computing. So we have at the top consciousness and free will, and I use this little cloud icon for that. Then we have a layer that isn't really talked about much, which I don't like the word non-conscious, but there's no other word. You can use subconscious or unconscious, but they all are non-words. So as you know, you have a whole lot of non-conscious capabilities. Some you're not aware of at all, like how to keep your balance when you're walking and things like that. So of the non-conscious biological mentality, there's also what I call robotic life, which is that which can be fully described by computing. So I'm laying this out as a way of looking at the problem, that there's really 3 layers here, not 2. There's not just consciousness and then physical world and how the 2 meet. There's really 3 layers. And so apparently it's taken a very long time for these layers to evolve from the bottom up, with each layer dependent on the layers below. So I'm saying that all of this has emerged just like life emerged from non-life. Eventually, robotic life ascended to non-conscious life, descended to conscious life. So it's a story that is how this took place. And my second point is that I think there's something more than computing even before consciousness. So in this middle layer of non-conscious biological mentality, I'm conjecturing something more than computing is going on. And we'll talk about that a lot in the later slides. But it's important to sort of set the stage here that unless you sort of assume that there's something more than computing, you're never going to find it. If you just assume everything is computing, then there's nothing to look for. Thirdly, apparently, in this evolutionary story that I'm going to try to tell, apparently some of the roadblocks that evolution overcame have involved energy problems. So with that, I've got this little diagram here. On the bottom, this blue arrow is hacked off into billions of years. So at the tip of the arrow, that's where we are right now. And this is the timeline of the Earth. So the Earth is something like 4.5 billion years old, and all bacteria emerged, or however they got here, on Earth very long ago. There's fossil evidence of bacteria 3.7 million years ago. And I've got the little symbol meaning that I'm perfectly willing to attribute everything bacteria do to computing. Now, this is all, conjectures, but it isn't until for billions of years, there was nothing but bacteria. There just wasn't any higher form of life. And nature finally evolved eukaryotes, to which I'm ascribing non-conscious biological mentality. Then later on, and then again, more than 1 billion years later, the advent of the true individual. This is an organism that has specialized cells, that it's not just a colony. There's some cells that can't reproduce, that they're specialized. And here we perhaps have the first glimmering of consciousness. Finally, we have very much more recently mammals and birds, warm-blooded creatures, where I'm conjecturing you can have something like full consciousness. Now, that doesn't mean that they have the same consciousness we have, because if you're familiar with Donald Hoffman's interface theory of perception, what we see and what we experience is sort of like desktop icons. They're things that our non-conscious has constructed for us in order to give us a good user interface to handle the world. But the point is, there's a story like this that I'd like to try to go through a little bit. So bacteria are almost as old as the Earth. Each cell is a very complicated biochemical adaptive process. And these colonies of bacteria exhibit additional emergent processes. In fact, Martin Robert in Japan claims that a lot of bacterial colonies have much more intelligent properties than they're given credit for. Perhaps all of this is covered by the nothing but computing conjecture. I'm willing to go along with that. But evolution was stuck at this level for 1.5 billion years. Nothing more, there was nothing else. Why? Well, according to a theory by Nick Lane, the bacterial size and capabilities were severely limited by power constraints. In other words, ATP production is limited by geometry. That should be, say, by geometry. It only occurs on the outer surface, the inner surface of the membrane of the bacteria, and you have sort of a geometric problem. If the bacteria were to grow bigger, the volume surface area ratio goes in the wrong way, and you don't make enough ATP to run the cell. So this gives us a hint that perhaps evolution finally getting unstuck from this required something new that involved overcoming an energy limitation. So if you look at eukaryotes, they have two things that bacteria don't have. They contain mitochondria. So mitochondria are like little units that are within the cell, and they do the metabolism. They produce the ATP that the cell uses from metabolizing food. And these mitochondria can be duplicated where and when needed. So you have thousands of mitochondria in each neuron, for example, and you have them clustered in areas like around synapses and things like that. But even single cell eukaryotes, they're full of mitochondria. So the eukaryotes solve the energy problem. They've got plenty of energy. Secondly, eukaryotes contain microtubules. These aren't found in the bacteria. Microtubules there's a lot of work going on in terms of the structure of microtubules, the possible quantum effects in microtubules, things like that. So microtubules and mitochondria are very, very important and very unique and very different from bacteria. Microtubules and mitochondria and neurons are the focus of all of this work that I think is extremely important. And I've got a reference to one paper there. And again, this work is not dependent on the Penrose objective reduction conjecture. So eukaryotes have these new properties that are enabled by energy. There's a big long list of properties. Again, Nick Lane has written a popular book about this. It's very, very interesting book, but you can get the idea that when eukaryotes came along, it's really a state change. We have just one word, life and non-life, but in some ways eukaryotes are so different from bacteria that it's almost a completely different thing that has occurred in evolution. The things that I find especially interesting is single cell eukaryotes can actively hunt. They can chase things and find them, and they have three-dimensional control of their internal cytoskeleton, which is composed of these microtubules. So they can do shape shifting, they can stick out pseudopods, they can engulf prey, they can chase things. So they have a level of autonomy and a level of activity far beyond what a single bacterium can do. So these factors suggest that maybe something more than computing is involved, as we'll be discussing. But I want to emphasize that this, again, is just a conjecture on my part here. So there's lots of things to talk about eukaryotes. I had a movie of one chasing another and catching it and everything, but I think these little creatures for Heyman are amazing. People collect these things. There's a scale on the bottom. You can see they're, like 1/3 of a millimeter big. They build these shells with multiple chambers. So they construct them. Again, this is one cell. It sticks out pseudopods and it finds material and it builds this three-dimensional structure full of these chambers and these partitions and openings connecting the chambers. And some species only use specific particles. Some only use, say, sponge spicules that have been discarded by the sponge. So the single cell fills these chambers and it's inside and it lives inside of this thing that it builds. So this is, to me, amazing. This is a single cell, obviously no brain, no nervous system, doing something very, very, very complicated. Now, when we get to the true individual, we have specialized cells. So we have reproductive cells and non-reproductive cells. So this is a big difference from multicellular forms where everything is the same and each part of the colony can reproduce the whole group. So these multicellular true individuals do this, collaboration, and perhaps they're the specialized, I'll call them proto-brain cells, are free of other tasks, may have found ways of collaborating their non-conscious capabilities. So I'm attributing non-conscious capabilities to cells, and I'm conjecturing that in the case of the true individual, perhaps their specialized proto-brain cells can do something like we would call collaboration, resulting in intermittent moments of consciousness. But it isn't until we get much, much more recently where we have warm-blooded creatures that I'm conjecturing maybe something like full consciousness. So we use the term cold-blooded and warm-blooded, isn't quite right. Cold-blooded means exothermic regulation, like basking in the sun, whereas warm-blooded, it's endothermic regulation of body temperature. So in mammals and birds, this is achieved not by muscle activity, not by running like in, say, a lizard or something, but it's achieved by having about 5 times as many mitochondria in the organs as the cold-blooded creatures. So you're warm-blooded, you're constant temperature, whether you're moving around or you're just sitting still. Now, endothermy gives greater stamina, speed, endurance, aerobic capabilities. Again, there's books written about this. But the point is that all biochemical reactions are dependent on temperature. A lot of them run a lot better than temperature. Something I didn't know is that, if a certain kind of lizard runs away and hides, he's sort of done for a while. He can't do anything for quite a while until he recovers. I mean, they can run fast, but they can't run very far. And then it takes a long time for them to sort of get enough energy to get going again. So to me, the stability of endothermic body temperature suggests that this intermittent consciousness might be more of a continuous affair in mammals and birds. So to recap, this first eukaryote broke this 1.5 billion year log jam by overcoming an energy problem. Consciousness may have required the true multicellular individual, not colonies, because it seems to be utterly dependent on non-conscious mentality, in that much more than maybe a single cell could support. But the more or less continuous consciousness that I'm ascribing to higher animals may have required the endothermic temperature regulation. Now, that's not the end of nature's state changes. I mean, those are the sort of the big ones from a long time ago. But when you get to primates, you have this very, very interesting phenomena of what I'll call micropackaging. So if you read this book referenced on the bottom here, I've taken from a table in that book, you can see that non-primates and primates, we've got more or less equivalent brain mass examples. So the spiny rat and the mouse lemur, they have very small brains and roughly the same number of neurons. But before primates, when the brain got bigger, the neurons got bigger too. So you have way more neurons in a chimpanzee, which has actually a smaller brain than a giraffe, than you do in the giraffe. You've got, more than 3 times more. So primates invented sort of micro packaging of brains. So that's, to me, another state change. And of course, you have anatomical changes. So the primates have a prefrontal cortex that has no counterpart in the mouse. So there's sort of new kinds of brain that have come into being. So there's more state changes than that. So now, of course, the latest state change is the modern human, which has capabilities far exceeding any other form of life. And somehow this, to me, this fact is obvious, but it's sort of become politically incorrect to talk this way. But it just is true. I mean, our language capabilities go far beyond signaling and expressing what animals can do. We can speak about something, we can write it down on paper. It becomes an objective fact that we can talk about, criticize, and correct. We can do things that no other animal can possibly do. So I'm not going to talk about human capabilities, but I do want to mention that our non-conscious capabilities are sometimes slighted. In other words, we talk about lust and rage and non-conscious things sometimes are thought of as like subhuman. But yet, if you read a book like Hadamard's Psychology and Invention in the Mathematical Field, you realize how powerful our unconscious capabilities are. In this book, he describes working on a very difficult math problem, looking at it from all angles consciously, just totally giving up, and then going about his business. And then he's getting on a streetcar, and the moment he reaches up and grabs the handle of the streetcar to get on the streetcar, the solution just hits him. So all along, his non-conscious capabilities were working on this tough math problem that he couldn't solve when he was consciously working on it. And of course, there's tons of examples of from music and art and science and things like this that you're much more than your consciousness. So we could have drawn a bigger diagram like this, where the bacteria, of course, they're still around. Maybe they're just computing. The eukaryotes have this non-conscious capability, which eventually evolves into consciousness of some kind, and then this consciousness evolves into what we have today with us. So now let's back up a little bit. So let's go about this idea of transcending robotic mentality. So if non-conscious biological mentality, excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water here. If this has some evolutionary value, it must do something that you can't do with computing processes. And I'm very respectful of computing processes. I'm amazed at what I can do on my, on my cell phone even. So biophysical computing processes cover multiple feedback control, layers of adaptive control, learning systems. I'm perfectly agreeable with the idea that you can do machine learning. It's done all the time. So what else is there? Why doesn't this cover everything? Well, my conjecture, which I put in red here because it's very different, is that transcending computer robotic mentality provides some degree of autonomy or externality from the physical world that causally influences the organism. So again, this is before consciousness. I'm saying non-conscious capabilities gives you this degree of externality. And how this autonomy can help the organisms, I'm going to talk about in a couple slides. But first, I'm going to hit what seems to be an obvious objection, which is, doesn't this violate the conservation of energy? In other words, if you had something external to the physical world, say, adjusting your synapses a little bit, it requires energy. Where does this energy come from? Well, there's two possible answers. One answer I'm not going to talk much about. It's that the conservation of energy principle needs to be modified at the quantum level. The second one is one that I'm more interested in, is that, well, maybe it does violate the conservation of energy in what we now call the physical world. But if we extend the real world, our concept of the real world, to include something I'll call mentality space, then the conservation of energy perhaps is still violated with the physical world, but there's a reason for it. So quantum thermodynamics is a big and growing field, and I'm not going to get into it, but there's conferences, there's tons of papers about it. I've pulled these two quotes from two papers, and I've highlighted in yellow. You get the idea that our fundamental notions at the macro level, heat, work, entropy, maybe are only limiting work in the macro limit, and they don't work at the quantum level. And you even have people suggesting in the second quote that the conservation laws must be revisited at the quantum level. What I want to talk about, which now we're getting very strange, is this idea of mentality space. And if you look at these arrows, I've got an arrow going into mentality space from the physical world, and I've got a lightning bolt, and I've got a littler arrow coming back to the physical world. So what do I mean by all this? Well, I'm conjecturing that energy, well, I actually want to go backwards. If mentality, if you consciously can affect your brain, in other words, if you can have the freedom to say, I'm going to move my finger now and make your brain move your finger, your brain can't be totally deterministic. There has to be something outside of your brain that has messed with your synapses to allow you to move your finger. That requires energy. This energy had to come from someplace. Well, if it came from someplace called mentality space, how did the mentality space get the energy? Well, I'm saying that the energy was from the physical world. So energy is transformed to mentality, some of which is consumed by mentality itself, and some re-injected, less re-injected than what was drawn. So this is an experimentally falsifiable conjecture because the conservation of energy is violated. We could test it. We don't need humans to test it. We could test it at the level of eukaryotes. So In classical mechanics, there's no compulsory minimum energy expenditure required to perform a measurement. You can measure whatever you want with less and less energy. You just have to make better and better measuring devices. There's no compulsory minimum energy limit. On the contrary, if you implement a quantum measurement, there's compulsory energy measurements. Now, we're not talking about a quantum measurement on the blackboard. We're talking about an actual quantum measurement in the real world. So there's a lot of different papers about this, and I find it the papers somewhat in conflict with each other to just exactly what is meant here. So in the paper that I quote at the bottom, an energy minimum must be injected into the measuring device to do a standard projective measurement, as opposed to an inefficient measurement where the facts of the situation are different. So this gets us to what I'll call the great quantum interpretation model. There's this paper on the archive about it. There have been papers since then about it, where this paper tried to classify all of the many different interpretations of basically the measurement problem, but quantum physics in general. And certainly, you can say there's no consensus about this. I'm hoping that there's a biological mentality interpretation in the making. Far from being done, it's a work in process. But here we want to take free choices seriously. That free choice of the quantum measurement starts outside the quantum system in making the choice of measurement. And biological mentality is what provides this externality, excuse me. In other words, the physical world is not closed, and causal closure requires including mentality space. So unlike consciousness causes collapse theories, consciousness per se is not required. Mentality provides the free choice of the measurement basis and the energy required to actualize a measurement that affects the physical world. And again, this measurement is basically in your brain. So mentality enables what Stuart Kaufman calls non-prestatable outcomes, or unprestatable outcomes. Mentality enables what I call drawing a ball from outside the urn. In other words, you don't have to, you can't simulate it because you can't list the possible, the space of possibilities. You have mentality gives you this freedom, this externality to find genuine newness. So let's see. I want to say here that I think I mentioned all of these things already. So this is again sort of a recap. But in this evolving theory that I'm working on, the now is a real and driven by free choices of energy reinserted into the physical world from mentality space. And so this coevolution of mentality space with the physical world requires a modification to the theory of evolution. In other words, evolution is not driven exclusively by physical causes such as random mutations. The mentality of animals and organisms, once they get mentality, are conditions for variation. So we still have variation and selection, but the conditions for and the causes for variation are now drawn from both the physical and the mental worlds. So to recap everything here and sum it up, so I'm saying consciousness came after billions of years of non-conscious biological mentality, which itself is more than computing. This more is this degree of autonomy or externality from the physical world. And this biological mentality is powered by and acts upon the physical world by means of energy conversion, with less energy returned than taken. And the coevolution of mentality space in the physical world of living organisms will require rethinking the underlying variation mechanisms of evolution. Last, I want to paraphrase Karl Popper, We live in a universe of emergent novelty, novelty that is not reducible to any of the previous stages. Yet we should try reductions wherever possible. Reductions are the way we do science and are very important to do, but we shouldn't be blinded and just assume that everything ultimately is reducible to everything at a lower level. So this is the end, and I'd be happy to take questions